Hi, thank you for joining us here today. My name is Lauren McCowan, and I am Site's Communication Strategist, and I am joined today by Brittany Montgomery, one of our doctoral researchers in the Site program. And I'm really excited about our conversation today. Brittany and I are going to talk a little bit about the role of ethics in technology evaluation. So, Brittany, I'm wondering if you could start us off by just talking a little bit about what ethics are. You know, how do we think about ethics within technology evaluation?
So simply defined, ethics really means principles of decent human conduct. How would you want to be treated? How would I want to be treated? Principles of fairness, of honesty, of decency, of respect. And so maybe you've heard of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take, where they pledge to do no harm to their patients and to treat everyone with dignity and fairness. And so that oath is one good example of ethical principles.
Got it. And so take me from sort of the, doctors and the medical field to technology evaluation and global development. How do ethics sort of translate into that environment, and why are they important in that environment?
So that's a great question. You know, there are many professions. I mentioned the medical profession, civil engineering, accounting, city planning. There are lots of professions that have principles of ethics. But international development professionals come from such a wide variety of professions that we don't really have a unifying principle of ethics. And so in evaluations, even though we're not directly treating an illness, we still have the potential to harm whoever is a participant in our evaluations. And so we have to think very carefully about ethics in an evaluation. It requires us to take a step back and think about the motivation, our motivation for evaluating products in the developing world. And I think really that boils down to our goals of helping to improve the quality of life and enhancing capabilities for people around the world. So we most certainly don't want to put them in harm's way during our evaluations.
Right. And so how do we, if we sort of think about this, in the day-to-day life of a development practitioner, what are some of the situations in which a development practitioner, or say someone conducting a technology evaluation, might run up against an ethical consideration? What are some of those common scenarios?
So there are a couple of main kind of interaction points that we see in product evaluation. Even though the idea of product evaluation is really talking about a product, we come into contact with many people during that evaluation. And so there are two kind of broad categories of interactions. The first, I would say, is thinking about interviews with potential users of the evaluation that might be testing our products, that might be giving us information about how they use the product in their daily lives, or even product manufacturers. And I would say the second really typical interaction that we have with other people during the process of an evaluation is in product testing and data collection in the field. So for example, Site tested the durability of solar lanterns in the field by giving them to real users of those lanterns in Uganda.
Great. So Uganda is one example of where we sort of ran into some of these ethical considerations. What are some of the actual ethical dilemmas that start to occur when you're doing field-based testing?
So there are three main challenges that I would say Site comes across consistently in all of our product evaluations. And the first of those is creating clear and just expectations about how participation in our evaluation might benefit interview subjects, product testers, product manufacturers, or other people and organizations involved in the evaluation. For example, any sort of evaluation undertaken by a Western researcher in a non-Western country is going to create a power differential. And so people with low incomes or little education might have a completely different set of expectations about what they would get from participating in the evaluation. And we have to be conscious of that. Mm-hmm. Or even gender differences. Say, right, sending a male researcher to work with an all-women's organization like the Self-Employed Women's Organization in India can also create a power differential. Now in that case, we actually involved other women as enumerators in surveys and interview questions to rectify that situation. And so really we have to think about and be cognizant of these different power dynamics. But at the same time, we have to do something about it and have to make sure that we're working together with our partners in the evaluations to create reasonable and just expectations around what's going to come out of the evaluation. And so another example that kind of highlights that is building trust and rapport with our interview subjects. And so we may go into the field and want to understand how people use a product, and we don't want to waste people's time or give them false hopes of, say, compensation, for example, by participating in an interview. So if we have to ask those questions, what are we going to give to someone in return for their time? And so if we don't compensate someone, for example, we might return really valuable information to them. So in the case of looking at water filter test kits in India, after we tested different water types, we gave households the ability to go back and test their own water and taught them how to use these test kits in their own home so that they could benefit from the evaluation.
Right.
And so another thing that we think about for these expectations is working with product manufacturers. We don't want to set up a situation in which a product manufacturer working on a new product, for example, may get an unfair advantage over other manufacturers just by participating in our evaluation.
Great.
And so a second challenge, I would say, that is really big is thinking about the trade-off between scientific robustness, which is what MIT and CITE are really known for, and what is socially just. And so, for example, you might think about wanting to understand the way a microgrid works based on solar panels for a small set of villages in any country, and go and say, well, the best way for me to figure this out is to select a random sample of households, give them electricity for a couple of weeks based on my microgrid, and test and see how well that went. Well, that's fundamentally unfair, even though it may be the most scientifically robust way to test. And I would say the third challenge is thinking about how we collect data in a manner that ensures the privacy and confidentiality of anyone who would be involved in that data collection. And so this is not just about interviewees or survey participants, but it's also about remote data collection with sensors. So for example, we have an evaluation with CITE that looks at different types of wheelchairs and uses sensor-based technology to get at how those wheelchairs are used in the field. And we want to make sure that in that evaluation, the data that we collect doesn't allow us or doesn't allow anyone else to track the location of that particular user or to identify him or her.
Right, absolutely. No, that's critical. So if I'm a person, taking this course, I'm one of the students, or I'm, thinking of conducting my own technology evaluation and, keeping these very challenging and real potential dilemmas, ethical dilemmas in mind, what are some of the ways that I can sort of consider ethics from the very beginning in building my technology evaluation out to ensure that those things are addressed? Things always pop up, but how can we sort of build that in from the beginning?
So I would say the very first step is to consider what the Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee in your particular country recommends. Now in the United States, we have an ethics committee that is run out of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that establishes specific guidelines for research institutions within our country. And there are many kinds of ethics review boards in countries all over the world. That's a great place to start for some initial guidelines. But with evaluation, we have to be really careful that we go beyond what those specific evaluation or requirements of an ethics committee are to look at the evaluation in detail and make sure that we're not unjustly or unfairly treating anyone that's involved in our evaluation. We don't want to have a detrimental impact on anyone during this process. And so, for every evaluation, we're going to have a distinct set of contextual variables or participants in the evaluation that shape those nitty-gritty details as to how we complete the evaluation. But we always have to think about ethics from the very beginning of that evaluation, from the scoping phase and from that initial planning phase. Ethics are fundamental in any kind of international development work, and they have to be at the forefront of product evaluation.
Well, Brittany, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. And thank you for watching. I think we'll be posting a list of resources and ethical questions that you can think about as you're designing your own technology evaluations in the field going forward. Thanks so much.
We've learned a lot over the past few weeks about the suitability, the scalability, and the sustainability elements of evaluation. Now, how do we put these pieces together, and do we even need to? You may remember from the beginning that the original idea behind the site evaluation was to combine all three S's, suitability, scalability, and sustainability, into one comprehensive evaluation. This was our original idea. But after working in the field over several years, we've realized that this is not necessarily the best approach to evaluation. Combining results is difficult, and it may not make sense. It's almost impossible to capture all of the learning that we achieve in evaluation through one integrated score chart or comprehensive evaluation. That's true for three reasons. First, consider the differences in the units of analysis between each of the three S's. Suitability is mainly looking at a product and the direct inputs it needs to function as a product. Scalability primarily looks at the supply chain as the unit of analysis. And finally, sustainability may look at an organization or its business model as its key unit of analysis. Now, the second reason why creating a comprehensive evaluation is so difficult is because each of these three S's, in addition to having different units of analysis, also come from different academic disciplines, or you might call those different methodological paradigms. For example, suitability comes mainly from the field of mechanical engineering and incorporates design of experiments into its particular methodology. In the case of scalability, we look at all sorts of different ideas, including the supply chain, management science, and behavioral operations in trying to understand that particular dimension of a product. And finally, sustainability is centered on user research or understanding socio-technical systems. These are many different scales, and trying to combine them into one comprehensive evaluation is extremely difficult. Finally, I would suggest that building something into one particular score chart or one comprehensive evaluation may unintentionally reduce the results to only those results that are quantifiable. But quantifiable results aren't necessarily our most important learnings from the evaluation. Take, for example, our solar lantern evaluation, in which we learned that having a cell phone charger that was attached to the solar lantern was in fact more important to the end user of the product than was the actual capability to charge the lantern. Now, that's something that we can't boil down to a single number. So we have to keep in mind that these three elements of what makes it difficult to combine all three S's are actually helping us get to more interesting and greater learnings from our evaluation. So given the difficulty of combining them, we've often at site taken a pragmatic approach to product evaluation, in which we consider in detail the audience that will use those particular findings and the context in which the findings of the evaluation will be used in order to determine which parts of the evaluation, whether from the suitability, the scalability, or the sustainability element, or even elements from all three particular vectors of the site evaluation, will be reported and used.
So you've conducted your technology evaluation. You have a lot of data, you have some really interesting findings that you'd like to draw out, but you have to bring it all together into sort of a final document, if you will, to present to your audience. One of the key things that we start with here at site is defining that audience. And we find that this is a really critical stage of the evaluation that should be done at the beginning and sort of throughout the process, but you may find that you want to do sort of a recalibration as you bring the pieces together. And so you might think about defining that audience in a few different ways. For us, it has evolved in different ways, and I'm going to explain a couple of those. So one way that audience might become clear is through the research question itself. So we've worked with partners to do technology evaluations where the research question really drives who our audience is. We're trying to answer that research question in tandem with that partner. One example of this is SITE's technology evaluation with the Malaria Consortium. The Malaria Consortium felt that they had a really good understanding of the devices that were available to them, malaria rapid diagnostic test devices, and how those devices worked. What they didn't have a good understanding of was sort of the scalability aspect of those devices. They had found that private sector actors were not thrilled to be stocking these devices in their clinics and wanted to find out why that was and what they could do in order to incentivize private sector actors to stock malaria rapid diagnostic tests. And so our evaluation and the resulting report was really driven toward meeting the needs of that audience, the Malaria Consortium, and helping them understand our findings in a way that they could act upon those findings. So that's sort of, thinking about your audience in terms of a research question. Another way that you can think about your audience is in terms of a research finding. So this is a case in which you may recalibrate at the end of an evaluation with an interesting finding and try to meet an audience that might be able to act on that finding. And for SITE, one example of this was in our water filter evaluation in Ahmedabad, India. One of the findings here was that there were a tremendous amount of low-cost water filters available on the local market, but that those water filters weren't actually doing their job. They weren't filtering the water effectively. On the other side of the spectrum, you had high-cost filters that weren't accessible or affordable for lower-income families. And so SITE found that there was really a gap in the market. And this was an interesting finding to us because it suggested that there was room for innovation, there was room for market growth and to sort of tap into a new kind of technology here. And because of that, our final report focused on meeting the needs of a couple of different audiences, but in particular reaching product designers. And we actually were able to reach a product designer who read the report and was interested in this gap and is now designing and developing a new type of water filter that he believes can sort of meet this need. So for us, that was a really great outcome. And that's another way that you may think about the audience or the target of your report. So I'm going to give you just a few quick tips for how to bring your report together into a final deliverable. How do we bring all of those pieces together? So the first tip is to keep it brief and concise. If possible, think about various formats, whether it's going to be digital or delivered in person. We recommend keeping something to 1 to 5 pages. You can always dig deeper if you need to later. The second thing to keep in mind is quantifying your results in comparative charts if you're able to. So we've talked a lot about the different ways that we can put together comparative charts to compare technologies across families and enable that decision maker, your audience, to really get in there and understand the differences in those technologies. Another thing to keep in mind is to draw out those surprising, counterintuitive findings. In one example, a SITE researcher found that while reverse osmosis water filter systems at a systems level were actually very efficient in their use of water, at a household level they were very inefficient, wasting a lot of water that could have been reused, particularly in India, which is a water scarce region. This was something that we wanted to make sure to draw out so that water experts who were reading the report would sort of get that finding, something that they wouldn't normally expect. So draw those out into the beginning. Another thing to consider is that you have a lot of data on your hands. Choosing what comes first, second, third is going to be difficult. If you have things that you want to dig a little bit deeper into, that's okay. Pull those out into a side format or a side deliverable where you can really develop those ideas and keep the main report full of key findings. And finally, if possible, make your end deliverable action-oriented. Help your audience make the decision confidently at the end of the day, knowing that data is behind the decision that they're making.